Welcome. My name is Christopher Paisley. I'm a Philadelphia public school teacher, and this is my YouTube channel, Inside White Fragility. Today I'd like to talk about how anti-racism is anti-science. Modern anti-racism, which is based on critical race theory and focuses on systems instead of people, has become the new way to think about race in America. Although the term anti-racism sounds admirable and courageous and brings to mind equality and justice, its core tenets are far from productive, healing, or unifying. Anti-racism actually turns Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream on its head and uses race and skin color to stereotype and judge entire groups of people, and operates under the premise that in order for one race or culture to succeed, we must disrupt or dismantle another. Anti-racism is zero-sum and teaches that all whites are inherently racist and privileged and suffer from internalized superiority, that all people of color are victims who suffer from internalized oppression, and that failure to support anti-racism is to support and perpetuate racism and white supremacy itself. The most interesting thing about anti-racism is that it is anti-science. Not only do the leading scholars promoting anti-racism fail to adequately test their theories using measurable quantitative analysis, but today's leading anti-racist educators have outright rejected the scientific method as biased because they argue objective science are the tools of Western white supremacist culture. A quick look at the pamphlet called Aspects and Assumptions of Whiteness and White Culture in the United States, published by the National Museum of African American History and Culture, shows this to be true. Robin DiAngelo, whose book White Fragility has sold over 2 million copies, has minimalized the use of quantitative analysis. In an article by writer and economist Jonathan Church, titled The Orwellian Dystopia of Robin DiAngelo's PhD dissertation, Church exposes DiAngelo's lack of scientific rigor. For her dissertation, DiAngelo conducted 4 two-hour sessions on interracial dialogue with only 13 participants, a very small sample from which to derive wide-ranging interpretations about things like whiteness and racism. But that is par for the course in fields like whiteness studies and critical race theory. As one paper argues, many critical race scholars are fundamentally skeptical of, if not simply opposed to, quantitative data and techniques to begin with. In DiAngelo's seminal paper, White Fragility, she states, "Whiteness studies begin with the premise that racism and white privilege exist in both traditional and modern forms, and rather than work to prove its existence, work to reveal it." Think about that for a moment. DiAngelo starts her work with the conclusion that racism and white privilege exist everywhere, not a hypothesis. Do racism and white privilege exist everywhere? And rather than running tests to prove this false, she only performs research to prove it true. In other words, she sets up her theories so that they can only be confirmed, not falsified, which is a major flaw and does not meet what is known as the principle of falsification. DiAngelo turns the scientific method on its head. A quick look at this flowchart reveals just how anti-science white fragility is. DiAngelo skips the research question, the hypothesis, and the experiment and goes right to the so-called results and conclusions. And what are the conclusions? That racism and white privilege exist everywhere. Has she run tests or done any quantitative studies to prove this? Of course not. Why? Because she considers objective science racist and the tools of a white supremacist culture. Anti-racism is anti-science and is filled with logical fallacies that don't stand up to rigorous inquiry, which is why DiAngelo refuses to engage in any kind of scholarly debate. She's more of a political activist or cult leader than she is a serious social scientist. In July of 2020, when her book White Fragility blew up after the George Floyd protests, she was invited to debate John McWhorter on MSNBC's Morning Joe. But of course, DiAngelo didn't show. She stayed behind, sending Georgetown professor Michael Eric Dyson to do her dirty work.
We invited Robin DiAngelo to take part in this discussion this morning. She unfortunately was unable to join us, but we hope to have her on the program soon. But we wanted to proceed forward with this fascinating discussion, and so we instead have the man who authored the foreword for the book with us, social commentator Michael Eric Dyson.
Ibram X. Kendi, author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, is also anti-science, which forces him to play the same game as DiAngelo. Kendi refuses any kind of public debate, turning down invitations from Coleman Hughes and John McWhorter, instead preferring to play the role of activist minister, lecturing his faithful anti-racist congregation, shielding himself from any real academic debate over his ideas. Why? Because as John McWhorter has pointed out, Kendi's ideas are overly simplistic and lack the backing of scientific research and rigorous quantitative analysis. Take his idea about the racial achievement gap in America, for example. The very idea itself is racist, he argues, insisting the supposed gap is simply the result of poorly designed, culturally biased, standardized tests. As Jonathan Chait writes in The Intelligencer, it does not matter to Kendi how many different kinds of measures of academic performance show the achievement gap to be true, nor does he seem receptive to the possibility that the achievement gap reflects environmental factors, mainly worse schools, but also access to nutrition, healthcare, outside learning, and so on, rather than any innate differences. To Kendi, all racial disparities are the result of only one thing, racism. Hence, the racial achievement gap in America isn't really a gap at all, but merely the result of racist thinking. But science shows this isn't the case. The Princeton study, called Parsing the Achievement Gap 2, by noted researchers Paul Barton and Richard Coley, used 3 decades of educational and social science research to show that the skills gap is indeed real, and that a multitude of factors, in addition to systemic racism, play a part in the gap. Things like rigor of curriculum, teacher preparation, teacher experience and turnover, class size, technology in the classroom, fear and safety at school, parent participation, frequent school changing, low birth weight, environmental damage, hunger and nutrition, talking and reading to children, and television watching have an effect on academic achievement. But to Kendi, who espouses the anti-science behind anti-racism, the skills gap is a myth based in racism and white supremacy, because to Kendi, any suggestion that any of these factors has an impact on success in school is a racist idea. To Kendi, you are either racist or anti-racist, period. Like D'Angelo, Kendi starts with his conclusion that every racial disparity is evidence of racism. And instead of running tests to prove this false, he only performs research to prove it true. In other words, he sets up his theories so that they can only be confirmed, not falsified, which is a major flaw and does not meet what is known as the principle of falsification. Kendi also turns the scientific method on its head. A quick look at this flowchart reveals just how anti-science anti-racism is. Kendi skips the research question, the hypothesis, and the experiment and goes right to the so-called results and conclusions. And what are the conclusions? That racism and white privilege exist everywhere and are the sole factor at the heart of the skills gap. Has he run tests or done any quantitative studies to prove this, as Barton and Coley did with their groundbreaking paper, Parsing the Achievement Gap 2? Of course not. Why? Because he considers objective science racist and the tools of a white supremacist culture. Anti-racism is anti-science and is filled with logical fallacies that don't stand up to rigorous inquiry. Until we admit as much, this trendy yet divisive movement will further polarize and divide, placing politics over science and indoctrination over education.